Some confessions don't crash like headlines. They rise like hymns. They don't beg for forgiveness or demand attention. They simply stand there in the quiet, letting the truth hum beneath every word. For decades, Keith Urban was the golden boy of country music. The smile, the voice, the leather boots, the stadium lights. But at 57, in a dim Nashville studio, he finally laid down the performance and picked up something far more powerful: honesty. No roaring crowd, no flashing cameras, just a man, a guitar, and the weight of a lifetime settling softly on his shoulders. He didn't reveal a scandal. He revealed something harder: what it costs to keep shining when the spotlight won't turn off. In that moment, it wasn't Keith Urban the superstar speaking. It was Keith Urban the human being, someone who had walked through applause, addiction, love, loss, and quiet transformation, and finally decided to speak without pretending. And that decision would change the way the world saw him. Long before the spotlight found him, Keith Urban was just a barefoot boy sitting cross-legged on a rough carpet in a small Australian home, chasing a sound he could feel but couldn't name. The air smelled like eucalyptus and dust. Cicadas buzzed outside in perfect rhythm, and inside, the walls pulsed with the heartbeat of American country music. His parents weren't wealthy, but their house was alive with music. His dad sold instruments part-time. His mom adored country records, and the stereo spun the voices of Glenn Campbell, Don Williams, and Merle Haggard like sermons from another world. For Keith, these weren't just songs. They were windows into a life that felt bigger than the one outside his front door. At 4, he picked up a ukulele. At 6, a guitar. And from that moment, the strings became his language. Schoolmates teased him for being quiet, for obsessing over cowboy music instead of rugby. Teachers called him distracted. But the guitar never judged him. It didn't care about accents or awkwardness. It gave him a way to speak without stuttering. Talent shows came next. He was just a small kid with a soft voice, standing nervously under harsh lights. But the moment he sang, the room shifted. Judges smiled. Parents beamed. Neighbors leaned in through thin walls to listen. And when the applause came, Keith didn't celebrate like most kids would. He went home, sat by the window, and replayed every tiny mistake in his head, determined to get better. That relentless drive, part gift, part curse, was born early. By 12, his father made a decision that would change everything. He mortgaged their modest home to buy Keith a high-quality guitar, a risky gesture for a working-class family. "Make it count," his father told him. Keith did. Every evening, while other kids chased girls or played sports, he chased tone. He studied Chet Atkins videos, copied every lick until his fingers cramped, and when he couldn't afford new strings, he learned how to make broken ones sing. By 15, he was standing on sticky floors in smoke-filled bars, playing to strangers twice his age. He was too young to drink, but too hungry to stop. He didn't belong there, but somehow he fit. In those bars, surrounded by laughter, regret, and stale beer, he learned the truth. You find out who you are when no one's really listening. Night after night, he played like the universe was eavesdropping. He turned sadness into melody. He turned silence into rhythm. He wasn't trying to escape his small town. He was running toward the life he felt waiting somewhere out there. And when that final school bell rang, while friends chose safe jobs and predictable futures, Keith packed a suitcase, slung his guitar over his shoulder, kissed his mother's cheek, hugged his father tight, and whispered, "I'll make it worth it." Then he walked out the door. Not as a star, not even as a man, but as a dream in motion. When Keith Urban finally arrived in Nashville, the dream didn't open its arms. It crossed them and waited to see if he'd last. The word Nashville had sounded like prophecy back in Caboolture, a promised land where pain turned into poetry, and strangers sang their truths on neon-lit stages. But up close it wasn't golden. It was gritty, crowded, and unrelenting. He was 24, broke, and virtually unknown. The streets were filled with musicians chasing the same miracle, each one just as talented and just as desperate. Open mics weren't opportunities. They were battlefields. Every night, hundreds of hopefuls poured their souls into smoky bars, where half the audience wasn't even listening. If you didn't give everything, no one remembered your name by morning. Keith lived in cheap apartments with walls so thin he could hear other guitarists practicing in the next room. Their riffs bled into his, like a reminder that he wasn't alone, but also that he wasn't special yet. He recorded demos for other singers to pay rent, played backup for artists who barely acknowledged him, and more than once, he sold his own gear to keep the lights on. The dream didn't feed you. It asked if you'd starve for it. But where others crumbled, Keith sharpened. He formed a band called The Ranch, 3 young men bound by hunger, not fame. They loaded their equipment into rusted vans, drove to tiny county fairs, and played to indifferent crowds that clapped more out of politeness than passion. Yet, Keith attacked every note like the universe was listening from the back of the room. The nights blurred together. Gear loaded at dawn, songs scribbled in cheap motels, ceiling stains becoming silent witnesses to their exhaustion. Some nights, the crowds were so thin you could count them on one hand. Other nights, they played to rooms full of chatter, their music competing with the sound of people ordering drinks. But Keith kept showing up. He learned that Nashville doesn't reward dreams, it rewards endurance. It strips away illusions, one late night at a time, until the only thing left is the reason you started. And for Keith, that reason was simple. Music. Not fame, not fortune, not applause. Just music. He once said, "It's not ambition that keeps you alive out here. It's hunger, pure hunger." And that hunger became his engine. It burned through rejection, fatigue, and anonymity. It kept him playing even when no one clapped. It made him study every successful act like a blueprint, not to copy, but to build something that was unmistakably his. Slowly, Nashville started to notice. A session here, a gig there, a spark catching in a city made of gasoline and grit. But Keith wasn't celebrating yet. He knew how quickly the city could chew you up and spit you back home. So he kept his head down, fingers bleeding, songs pouring out like oxygen. He wasn't living the dream. He was proving he belonged in it. After years of playing to half-empty rooms and loading gear into dented vans at sunrise, the dam finally cracked. In 1999, Keith Urban released his self-titled American debut album. And suddenly, the radio waves that had once felt untouchable were carrying his voice across the country. Songs like "But for the Grace of God" and "Where the Blacktop Ends" didn't just chart. They resonated. His sound was different. Not too twangy for mainstream audiences, not too polished to lose its soul. It was raw, tender, electric. Critics called him the new face of country. Fans called him their own. The industry, which had ignored him for years, now couldn't get enough. Awards followed quickly. The ACM named him Top New Male Vocalist. The CMA handed him the Horizon Award. Nashville, once cold and indifferent, was suddenly looking directly at him. But success has its own kind of gravity. The bigger the stage got, the heavier everything else became. Overnight, Keith went from hustling for attention to living inside a spotlight that never switched off. Every lyric he wrote was analyzed. Every performance was scrutinized. He'd finally built the world he dreamed of. But now that he was standing in it, the walls started to close in. In the quiet moments between shows, an old friend came knocking. The bottle. What started as a way to take the edge off the relentless pressure slowly became a constant companion. Backstage, after shows, on tour buses, it was always within reach. The same hunger that had fueled his rise now turned inward, burning at both ends. On stage, he was magnetic. He made pain sound romantic, love sound epic, and heartbreak sound like a chorus worth singing along to. But off stage, the applause didn't follow him home. He once admitted in an interview that even in the middle of sold-out arenas, he sometimes felt like he was singing inside a cage made of sound. Fame, he said, wasn't freedom. It was just a louder kind of loneliness. The pressure to live up to the myth of Keith Urban was relentless. He stayed in the studio long after producers left, chasing that perfect mix of country grit and rock soul that no one else could replicate. The bar he'd set for himself rose with every hit, and so did the toll it took. Parties got louder. Nights got longer. The jokes got bigger to cover the cracks. What once felt like celebration started to look like escape. Friends noticed the change. The man who'd once played every note like the universe was listening, now played to drown out the noise inside his own head. Fame didn't just elevate him, it magnified everything. His talent, his insecurities, his vices, and slowly, the same fire that had carried him to the top began to scorch the ground beneath him. And just when it seemed like nothing could stop his ascent, a single encounter would change everything. It happened in Los Angeles, 2005, the kind of night that seems ordinary until you look back and realize it quietly rearranged a life. Keith Urban was at a charity gala, surrounded by celebrities, polished smiles, and the low hum of moneyed conversations. He was rising fast, his name climbing charts, his face appearing on magazine covers. But beneath the charming grin and the confident swagger, he was carrying the weight of nights spent alone, the pull of old habits, and a quiet exhaustion that fame never soothed. Then she walked past, Nicole Kidman, Hollywood's porcelain queen, elegance wrapped in quiet sadness. She wasn't just beautiful, she was arresting, the kind of presence that makes noise fall away for a moment. He introduced himself with a shy, almost boyish grin. She smiled back, not like a star greeting another star, but like a woman recognizing something familiar. Later, Keith would say, she didn't see the fame. She saw the man underneath. Their connection was instant, not flashy, not forced. Two people fluent in loneliness, speaking a language that didn't need translation. They started talking, and the conversation didn't feel like a first encounter. It felt like a continuation. In her, Keith saw something he hadn't felt in years. Stillness. And in him, Nicole found someone who understood the strange contradiction of public life, adored by millions, yet sometimes painfully isolated. Both had climbed to extraordinary heights, and both had learned how thin the air gets up there. Their romance moved quickly, but it wasn't reckless. It was intentional, like two people who had lived enough to recognize real connection when it arrived. For Keith, love wasn't just amuse anymore. It was medicine. His songwriting softened. His lyrics shifted from hunger and heartache to hope and healing. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't writing from the edges of chaos. He was writing toward a future. By June 2006, under the soft glow of Sydney's night sky, the world watched as Keith Urban waited at the altar of St. Patrick's Estate, hands trembling, heart thundering. Nicole walked toward him in lace, radiant but grounded, carrying both her Hollywood crown and her human heart. Their wedding wasn't a spectacle. It was a prayer whispered between two souls who had been burned by fame and found grace in each other's presence. When they kissed, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like redemption. But love, no matter how beautiful, doesn't erase demons overnight. Just 4 months after their wedding, headlines hit like thunder. Keith Urban enters rehab. For many, it was a shock. For Keith, it was a reckoning. The pressure, the fear of losing control, the years of numbing. It had all come to a breaking point. Nicole didn't run. She ran toward him. Quietly, away from cameras, away from gossip. She visited, stood beside him, shielded him. When asked later why she stayed, she simply said, "Because love doesn't run." That period became a crossroads, not just in their marriage, but in Keith's entire life. He could either keep performing for the world or start living for real. He chose the latter. Rehab wasn't a fall. It was the first step back to himself. And through it all, Nicole's faith didn't waver. Years later, Keith would say with his voice cracking, "She saved my life, not by fixing me, but by believing in me." Their love story wasn't a Hollywood fantasy. It was two imperfect people choosing to hold each other's hands at the edge of the storm. Rehab didn't end Keith Urban's story. It rewrote it. When he stepped back into the world, it wasn't with a roar, but with a quiet, determined hum. The wild edges softened. The noise faded just enough for clarity to seep in. He wasn't chasing survival anymore. He was learning how to build something that could last. His music began to change. Albums like Love, Pain, and The Whole Crazy Thing didn't sound like products. They sounded like confessions stitched to melodies. Songs such as Stupid Boy, Once in a Lifetime, and You Look Good in My Shirt weren't just hits. They were emotional fingerprints, each one capturing a man piecing himself back together in public. Critics called it his creative peak. Fans felt the honesty in every line. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about presence. At home, life blossomed. Nicole and Keith became a family. Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the way that truly matters. They welcomed their daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, into a world that was half red carpet, half quiet porches in Tennessee. Sundays often looked like this. Nicole barefoot on the porch, Keith strumming his guitar, their girls spinning barefoot in the grass while the Nashville sun melted into the horizon. For two global icons, those were the moments that felt real. Nicole's career was soaring in parallel. Moulin Rouge, The Hours, Australia, Rabbit Hole, Big Little Lies. She carried herself with the kind of grace that didn't need explanation. While the world saw a Hollywood powerhouse, Keith saw his wife, grounded, elegant, fiercely private. She found in Nashville a kind of peace she couldn't get from flashing cameras. Keith, on the other hand, threw himself back into the road. Touring became both a celebration and a test. Stadium after stadium, night after night, he delivered shows that felt like revival meetings. His performances were electric, personal, and soaked in gratitude. But each standing ovation had a shadow. For every roaring crowd, there was a quiet hotel room afterward. For every encore, another night away from home. This is the part of fame few people talk about. The toll of sustaining success once you've achieved it. At first, distance feels temporary. A tour here, a film shoot there. But over time, the miles start to build invisible walls. She filmed across continents: London, Paris, New York. He toured across America, moving from one stadium to the next. Their love letters became voice notes. Their I miss you texts became daily rituals. They called each other every night. But sometimes connection gets thinner, even when you're both trying. Keith once said in an interview, "Love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up even when you're exhausted." And for years, that's exactly what they did. They showed up. Through the flights, the rehearsals, the premieres, and the bedtime stories over FaceTime. They were pilgrims of ordinary joy, carving out pockets of normalcy in a life that was anything but. But behind the perfect photographs and award show smiles, something subtle began to shift. Not a fracture, not a betrayal, just the slow, quiet cost of two extraordinary lives moving at extraordinary speeds. Fame is a double-edged mirror. It reflects beauty, but it also distorts truth. And while the world saw perfection, they were learning the delicate art of holding on to each other across oceans and schedules. By 2024, Keith was still on top of his game. His album High dropped like a heartbeat, proving that even after decades in the industry, he could still reinvent himself. The songs sounded freer, less like someone chasing a hit, more like someone finally breathing. Critics praised it as mature, soulful, and stripped down. But between the lines, you could feel it. A man searching for balance. The rebuild had worked. The family was strong. The career was thriving. But every great resurgence has its price. And fame's cost, as Keith was learning, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet spaces between calls, the flights that land after midnight, the songs written in hotel rooms while home keeps moving without you. And it was in those spaces that the next chapter of their story quietly began to take shape. When the noise finally faded, Keith Urban didn't chase it. He let it go. For decades, his life had been measured in applause. Sold-out tours, awards, headlines, flashing lights. Every chord he struck had once been a signal to the world. I'm here. Listen. But at 57, standing on the other side of everything he'd built, he began to discover a different rhythm. One that didn't need to be amplified. One that lived in the spaces between the notes. In interviews, his language shifted. He stopped talking about comebacks and hits. Instead, he spoke about stillness. About waking up in Nashville without a schedule that dictated his soul. About long walks in the Tennessee evening. about listening to cicadas the way he once did as a boy in Caboolture. He described music not as an escape anymore, but as a place to live. "I used to think happiness was applause," he said in one conversation. "Now I think it's being able to go home, sit with yourself, and not need anyone to tell you who you are." This wasn't resignation. It was arrival. For years, Keith had performed to prove something, to himself, to the industry, to the image everyone expected him to inhabit. But the real victory came when he realized he no longer needed to. The stage, once his battlefield, had become his sanctuary. And now it wasn't a place he stood to be adored. It was a place he stood to be understood. His newer music reflected that shift. Stripped-down acoustic sessions. Lyrics that didn't dress pain up as poetry. They let it breathe. A quiet honesty threaded through each song, like a man leaving a trail, not for others to follow, but to remember where he's been. At shows, there was a new kind of silence. The kind that happens when thousands of people are hanging on to every word, not because it's loud, but because it's real. During his final tour before stepping back, he ended each night not with fireworks, but with a song called "Still Here." No lights, no band, just him and a guitar. "I've broken in half just to learn how to bend. I've lost what I loved just to love it again. And if the world forgets my name or my song, I'll still be here, where I've belonged all along." When he sang those lines, arenas full of people fell into a reverent hush. There was no frenzy, no spectacle, just thousands of hearts recognizing their own stories inside his. He didn't bow dramatically afterward. He didn't deliver a grand speech. He simply stood there, guitar loose at his side, sweat catching the light, and whispered, "Thank you for listening to my life." In that moment, Keith Urban wasn't the golden boy of country music. He wasn't the chart-topping artist or the headline-making husband. He was the barefoot kid from Caboolture again, the one who believed music could save him. And in a way, it did. The spotlight that had once defined him now felt optional. Fame hadn't disappeared. It had simply become quieter. What remained was the man behind the legend. Steady, weathered, grateful. A man who had walked through addiction, adoration, love, loss, and rediscovery, and found something even greater than applause: peace. This was never a story about a fall. It was a story about evolution, about turning performance into presence, about learning that the most powerful music isn't always played to the world. Sometimes, it's played back to yourself. And as the curtain closed on this chapter of his life, Keith Urban didn't look like a man who had lost something. He looked like someone who had finally come home.